Greetings, chess players. This is T Nars, and this will be my first analyzed game on this channel. First video besides the introduction. This game was played at the Marshall Chess Club in their FIDE Monday event. My opponent was rated about 1690 FIDE, I believe about 1650 USCF, and I thought this was a very instructive game. I'll summarize what I believe are the main instructive points of the game at the ends, and also talk about them during the game. So let's get started. My opponent opened with king pawn, e4, c5, the Sicilian defense, and c3. This is opening I respect. It's actually what I usually play myself against the Sicilian, although I wouldn't play it quite like my opponent did in this game, and I'll go over the variations I like to play and some sample games in a future lecture. I played g6, which is what I play against most of the anti-Sicilians and the mainline Sicilians. My opponent immediately grabbed the center with d4, which is pretty much the point of the c3 Sicilian. You're not giving black two central pawns to one, as you would if you played knight f3. I'll go over that more in future lectures. I took, he took, and I played d5. So the point of d5 is I don't want to let I don't want to let white have the whole center. I want to challenge the center and force white to either push past, which does give him more space, but also this backwards pawn could be a liability later. And if I can somehow win this pawn, or undermine the pawn that comes forward with, say, f6, then I might be able to take the whole center for myself, maybe even win a pawn or two to boot. In this game, white takes the pawn, which is slightly less common, but it's fine. But it's also fairly fine for black. It's fairly easy for black to equalize here. Rather than take with the queen, exposing my queen to attack, I played knight f6 right away. He plays knight c3, and now I take. And now if white were to take and I take back with the queen, my queen is fairly safe here in a nice central location. So he throws in a check first. Quite sure about how good this move is. I block with the bishop. Blocking with the knight is also on c6 is also fine. Obviously, blocking with the knight on d7 drops a piece. So I block with the bishop, and he comes out with the queen. So one principle I'd like to talk about, which again I'll summarize at the end of this video, is that as white, you usually don't want to trade a lot of pieces in the opening. This helps black to equalize. And with an isolated pawn, as you'll see in this game, it's especially not so ideal to trade a lot of pieces, especially the queens, because the more pieces that come off the board, the more of a weakness this becomes. An isolated pawn is not necessarily weakness. It can be a strength with a lot of pieces on the board, because this pawn can support a knight here and here. It controls squares. As you can see, my central pawn on e7 is all the way back and is not controlling the center nearly as well as white's pawn is. But this becomes less of a factor as more pieces get traded. So let's carry on. I have a couple of options here. So let me just go back briefly. Now, in this position, if the knight were to take my knight, let's do a new variation, I could take the bishop. So this would be an equal exchange. Not only that, his knight is not really that well posted there. In fact, I'm threatening to take it right now, so it's probably going to have to back up unless white wants to defend it somehow. But this is an awkward position for white. So when I blocked at the bishop by creating a counter threat, I'm indirectly countering his threat against my knight. So he plays queen a4, and here I have a couple options. And this game's actually been reached in Master Play, I think once or twice. I believe knight takes knight was played in the one game. I forgot whether it was one or two games. But I decided to play knight b6. This gets my own knight out of harm's way. My knight actually is attacked now because he's threatening to just take the knight. And now I don't have bishop takes bishop because queen takes bishop is check, and I'm just losing a piece. So I decide to attack his queen, and if his queen wants to back up, then he'll be losing time. And if he wants to trade everything, which is what happened, he takes, I take with the queen, and he trades queens. Now I have slightly better development, and he still has this isolated pawn, which I'm going to gang up on, moving the bishop out, maybe removing the rook over here. So let's see how this game progresses. He prophylactically defends the pawn with his bishop. I play bishop g7. He plays knight f3. Both sides just developing. I castle, and he decides to castle queenside, which is probably a little bit risky. Generally, when you castle queenside, it's true he does bring his rook already defending this pawn. So this pawn is very well defended. I'm not going to win this pawn anytime soon. 1, 2, 3 pieces defending it. But his king is a little exposed, and I immediately take advantage of that by bringing my rook to the c-file, pinning his knight. And he moves his king out of the way. And this is often why you don't see castle queenside as much as castle kingside, because white has to spend a tempo usually to get his king out of the way. Now this move is not strictly necessary yet, as I don't have any concrete threats on this knight. Although, you know, I might want to pile up at some point with something like this. So he just gets out of the way and keeps it safe. Now I play knight c4. Not really threatening to take this bishop. A lot of players really enjoy, really value bishops over knights. I tend to think this knight is probably stronger than this bishop, which is kind of hemmed in by the pawns. It's doesn't have a very active role at this time. I'm also thinking about perhaps playing knight here check at some point, and if he takes with the b pawn, then I'll take his knight, and this actually does come about later in the game. Now he lashes out with h4, and this is a move that can be very scary with upside castling with queens on the board. But what I did, I played h5, and this was probably a slight mistake. As a chess player who's dealt with kingside attacks and lost a great many games with pawn storms and whatnot, I get, honestly, I'll admit it, we all get a little scared sometimes, and I do get a little scared when someone starts throwing their h-pawn forward. But without the queens on the board, this threat to keep pushing is really not that big a deal. And probably a better move, which I ended up playing later in the game anyway, was knight f6, stopping this threat because I can just take with a knight, and keeping my pawn structure flexible. You'll see later in the game that his knight comes here, and I have no way to kick it, whereas if he were to come here now, let's just say, I could play h6 and kick him back. So, but h5 is not a terrible move, it's just probably not the most accurate. So he plays knight d5, very simple threat to fork the king and rook. This type of thing happens to beginners pretty much all the time. As someone who teaches kids, it's almost every single game, or at least within a group of games that kids are playing, almost every single time I walk around the room to look at how the games are going, there's at least someone who's lost a rook to a knight fork. So I'm a little too good for that, fortunately. So I play rook to e8. This is not the ideal square for the rook, but I can always move him again later. And I don't really want to play something like this, giving up my nice bishop here. So I play rook e8. And he plays knight g5. Again, I talked about this knight is actually not that big a deal here in this variation, but this is one problem when you play the h-pawn here, that you can never kick this knight away unless I want to play the f-pawn, but then his knight would have a nice square here. So I come back with my own knight, knight f6, hitting this guy and forcing him to make a decision. If he wants to trade, that's fine for me again, because white has the isolated pawn. I'm not really too worried about trading knights, and he just retreats. Now I play my own knight to g4. As you can see, I'm attacking this twice, threatening to win a pawn, and he plays rook from h to e1. And now I play the move that I could have played earlier, but it comes with a little more force now because I have an added threat. So I play knight a3 check. So the idea here is if he takes, I'm going to take his knight, and what I have done is traded pieces, but I've gotten a concrete advantage in that I've messed up his pawn structure, and his king is much less safe than my king, which is surrounded by a bunch of pawns. So let's say he doesn't take. Now, why doesn't he just hide in the corner? Well, knight forks. Usually in the games of players above 13, 1400, you don't see a lot of knight forks, except of course in blitz and whatnot, because players are usually not going to fall into that, at least not in the opening phase. But his only other option besides to take the knight is to play here, which I actually thought was better in the game, and this is probably what I would play myself, because I really don't like getting bad pawn structure like this. But here, maybe I could play b5 or something like this, and it's, he could try to run here, but I really have a good position, and I can move this knight away, and his king is not really so happy where it's at. So he decides to, let me back up, he decides to just take it, but I'm happy with this. I'm getting my rooks active. He plays king to b2, and I double my rooks. And here's a point where white, who's definitely worse now, kind of compounds his problems. He plays rook c1, and when you have a worse pawn structure, when you have an isolated pawn, it's generally not a good idea to trade lots of pieces. And here's what he does. So I trade both the rooks, and if you'll notice, he can't take back with the bishop without losing this pawn, so he has to take back with the king. And here I actually play a bad move, which brings me to one of my next lessons of this game. I thought this was a very instructive game, very simple game, not tons and tons of complicated tactics or maneuvering, but very simple, and the type of simple win that you can actually get against low-rated players who play. I'll say one thing about this guy. He played very quickly, and generally this game was actually a 2-hour game, 120 minutes per side with a 5-second delay. And when you have a lot of time, I mean, it sounds very obvious, but when you have a lot of time, don't rush. Some players, not myself particularly, are very good playing fast. There's a lot of players who are very good at blitz, but even if you're one of them, you still should take your time. Even if you see what you're 95% sure you're going to do, just look at it a little more. And I actually, on my next move, got caught up in the trap of moving a little too quickly. My opponent was playing fast. I thought, oh, this guy's fairly weak. Let me just kind of polish him off as fast as possible so I can go get some dinner and watch some of the games of stronger players and just chill out. And I played bishop f6, which is actually a very poor move, and it's not really that deep as to why it's a poor move. If you want to pause the video for a moment, try to figure out how white can solve his problem here. And in the game he played g3, which is terrible, but what he could actually do, is just play knight f3, and he's defending this pawn. It's true I can take here and probably have a slightly better endgame because these pawns are bad. I have a long-range bishop against a short hopping knight, as Ron Henley likes to say. But, it's not clear. I'm not up any material. His king can actually, come down fairly quickly and maybe cover these weaknesses. There's still quite a few pawns on the board, so the bishop's power over the knight is not necessarily so evident quite yet. So this was actually a psychological mistake I made. Because my opponent was moving fast, I thought, well, I'll attack his knight. If his knight moves, I'm going to take the bishop and take this pawn. But it's very simple. This is, one thing I want to make clear in this channel, a lot of players who are, 13, 1400, they think, wow, people who are 18, 1900, 2000, 2100, they're so good, they're seeing 2 or 3 moves ahead all the time. They might, lose to GMs and IMs, but they're really very good. But this move is very obvious why it's bad. Just a simple one move answer, and all of a sudden, from being very much winning, I'm only slightly winning. And against best play, maybe this is a draw. I could have the 2 computers played out, but that's not really the point here. The point is that I shouldn't have missed this. Now, a better approach is I just take the bishop and then bishop h6. Now, if the knight moves, he's losing this pawn, and if the king moves, then this is similar to the game where I'm trading all the pieces and I'm going into a winning king and pawn endgame. So, fortunately for me, my opponent still continued to play fast, and he defended this h-pawn through the knight, but now he allows me to liquidate into a winning king and pawn endgame. And this is another critical lesson, maybe one of the most critical of this entire video, is that you cannot be too casual about going into an endgame like this. With the minor pieces on the board, you could say, well, black is better, but it's all very abstract. For black to actually win, he's got to do a lot of maneuvering, and it's a long, arduous process. But in this position, this is actually quite straightforward. Black has a number of advantages. He's got better queenside pawn structure, and he's got better kingside pawn structure, and most importantly, he's going to make a passed pawn of this h-pawn. So I'll show you how I do that right now. One thing I considered playing was f6, and then after gf, pawn takes, but the problem is, now I'm giving white a passed pawn, oops, which he probably wouldn't push right away like this, but nevertheless it's a passed pawn and a connected passed pawn. It's true I could make my own connected passed pawn on the king side, but I don't want to give white anything. So what I did, instead of f6, I played king g7. White's king starts coming forward, as he should do. Played f6, g takes, and now king takes. Now you'd think, some players might think, well, why do I want to give myself an isolated pawn? Don't I want to have fewer pawn islands? But more important, in the endgame, the most important thing is to make a passed pawn. An outside passed pawn, especially in king and pawn endgames, is the best kind of passed pawn. So I'm trying to get my king up as fast as possible, and I want to keep this guy here to defend against white having a passed pawn. So I take with the king. He plays e4. I play g5. Plays king e3, h4, gh, gh. And all of a sudden, after only 32 moves, I have a winning king and pawn endgame. I have a passed pawn, and while he goes to eat up this passed pawn, I'm going to take his pawns and queen e pawn. But the instructive value of this game is not over yet. So he plays king to f4, and I throw the h pawn forward, forcing him to chase after it. So he chases after it. He pushes the e pawn, king e4, king g4, king takes pawn, king f5, and king d5. Now, I actually cut this pretty close between a win and a draw, sometimes even a loss. This type of position is very precarious. If I'm ever ran out of moves, well, let me just show you what happens to illustrate my point. So here, white plays a4. Now what would happen if he plays e6? Well, here I would play a4. Now if he can't move the king anywhere to defend the pawn, so he has to waste a move. And now I'll play here. Only one move left besides the king move, and now I can play here. And he's got no moves to continue to defend this pawn, so he has to move out of the way, and this is an easy win. So what happened in the game, he just played a4 instead. I played a5, a3, b6, and now, no matter what he does, he's in trouble. If he pushes the pawn as he does in the game, I can continue to attack the pawn, but he cannot continue to defend it, and he's losing the pawn. If instead of pushing, he moves the king, here is the only square that continues to defend the pawn. Now I can push the pawn up one square, and again, he can't come here, here. He has to back off, and I'm taking this pawn with a win. So, why am I saying this is not the best variation? Well, let's go back. So in this position, instead of pushing the pawn, which is what I did, which is winning, but you saw it was very close. I had to basically get him in Zugzwang. Wait, Zugzwang or Zwischenzug? No, Zugzwang. Sometimes I get those mixed up. Zugzwang is a German word. It means something like compelled to move. And we're going to go back here quickly. And you see here white is, after e6 and king d6 on move 41, white is compelled to move. He has to move out of the way. If he could just pass, then if he could just pass, and I would have to move out of the way. Then he could come here with his king. I go back, and he comes here. and all of a sudden I'm the one who's compelled to move, and I'm the one losing the pawn, and he's queening in a couple more moves. So I have to admit, embarrassingly, again, I was caught up in moving fairly quickly because my opponent was, which is something that after more than 1,000 tournament games I should know better than to do. And it's always important to remember, just because your opponent's moving fast doesn't mean he has to keep moving fast. He could stop at any minute and pause for 20 minutes and figure out how to beat you just because you're following in his footsteps moving fast. So that's a critical lesson, one that I actually didn't mention in the notes at the end of this video, but it's very important to remember. So, okay, here we are again. Instead of playing h3, I could have played e5 check. And this is a very critical move to remember. If you'll imagine, these two pawns gone, these two pawns gone, these two pawns gone. Say, I'm not going to clear the board. I could use like special effects and video editing to do that, and perhaps that'd make for a better presentation. But chess is all about visualization. Anyway, no matter what kind of pieces you're using, what color the squares are, you're playing it in your head, and you have to visualize. So if you would visualize all the queenside pawns gone, the kingside pawn gone, just the center pawns. Obviously, in that position, black is fighting for a draw, and he would get the draw with e5. After e5, pawn takes, king e6, and uh-oh, white is losing this pawn. Say he backs up. I can take. Again, this is an imaginary situation. We're not talking about the game right now. We're imagining all other pawns are gone. And here, black has an easy draw. If you don't know how to draw in this position, there's plenty of videos online how to draw once your king is in front of pass pawn, king and pawn versus king. So this is a critical position. And this is a move that comes in handy also to help you win. And in this case, it would be the best move, better than h3, because it's much cleaner. So let's play out some moves. e5 check, d takes e. Again, if he doesn't play d takes e and he just moves his king somewhere, let's say, we're just going to take anyway. And after king takes, well, we're just going to queen this guy. So that's not an option. So pretty much the only reasonable move is to take. I move, and he goes after my pawn. I take his pawn, he takes my pawn. And I don't think we really need to go any further. Black is just going to go clean up the queen side and queen one of his pawns. So that would have been a cleaner way. I wouldn't have had to calculate it just perfectly to get him in Zugzwang. But let's go over the end of the game just for completeness. So I didn't play that e5 move. And one thing that bothers me is that I didn't even consider that e5 move, which is a move that a strong player should consider. And I wonder sometimes whether to even call myself a strong player. I was pretty proud of this game, but I made numerous mistakes, including bishop f6 earlier, which pretty much threw away most of my advantage. But let's go over the rest of the game. King g3, king g5, king takes pawn, king f4, e5, king e4, king g4, takes pawn, here, a4, a5, a3, b6, e6, and Zugzwang. He has to move, I take the pawn, and I push. He could try to block the pawn, but if he tries to block it, I'm just going to push it as far as possible and take these two guys, and it's an easy win. So he goes after these guys. I don't think he seriously expects to win or even draw now, but he's just playing on to make me prove that I know what the hell I'm doing, which is reasonable because sometimes I don't. But here, I'm pretty confident. e4 takes the pawn, e3 takes on a5, and here I decided to block the king off. I could just go ahead and queen and chase his king around and win these pawns and checkmate him, but I thought this would probably lead to the faster checkmate. King a6, king c6. Here he could go back and try to chase the pawn again, but he pushes. e2, king a7, e1 queen, a6, king c7, a4, and queen e8. And it's another Zugzwang. He's compelled to move, but his only move is to play here. And then we have a checkmate. So, let's go to the famous word pad and look at the lessons from this video. Number one, if you're white, don't trade lots of pieces right away, especially if you have an isolated pawn. And again, I'm putting the moves that this applies to right here that you can read. I'm going to include the PGN file. If I lost the game, I'm not going to include my opponent's name because I feel like that's not fair. If I won the game, I'm not going to include my opponent's name. If I lost the game, I will include my opponent's name because might as well give them credit for smashing me and teaching me a lesson. Okay, so lesson 1. If you're white, don't trade lots of pieces, especially if you have an isolated pawn. Number 2, avoided weakening pawn moves, and this is regarding my move on move 15, h5. That was not necessary. It didn't play a critical factor in the game because I had a nice advantage, but it could have come back to haunt me later. Number 3, look for tactics even if they do not win material. In this case, we're talking about if you can visualize from the game, and if not, feel free to watch the video again. My knight to a3 check move. I was fairly proud of that game, although it was not sophisticated in the least. And that is my idea of these videos, not to show you some crazy Gary Kasparov game and make you feel bad about yourself like you're never going to see these moves. Again, I'm not that strong a player. Experts are not that strong. Even if you're 13, 1400 and you think they're really strong, they're not. They make lots of mistakes, and you can play just like them and stronger than them. And that's what I'm hoping to teach you here. So, yeah, look for tactics. The best kind of tactic is a tactic that is winning material by force. The second best is one that's winning material by force in some lines and at least maintaining some kind of positional advantage in all the other lines. Number 4, maybe the most important, be extra careful in the endgame. One small mistake can lead to a difference between win, draw, or loss. And number 5, do not be casual about going into a pure pawn endgame, because pure pawn endgames are either a win, a loss, or draw. There's not really a whole lot of room for, well, maybe it's winning, maybe it's losing. It's usually quite clear, and there's no room for screwing around. So be very careful before you go into a pawn endgame. I made this mistake in another game, which I may show later, between me and my friend Larry Saxby from Philadelphia, where it was a knight game that was that was worse for me for a long time, and I finally buckled under the pressure and decided to trade knights, hoping I could hold the king and pawn game, and I was wrong. So we'll go over that game later. And number 6, remember the 1 versus 2, the 1 pawn versus 2 connected pawns sacrifice. Endgame trick. It could help you either salvage a draw or help you win in the most efficient way, as I could have used it in this game. So I hope you got something out of this. I hope you learned the lessons. Feel free to watch the video again. I'm a little more verbose than I would have liked. I see this video has gone almost half an hour. Please bear with me. Give me comments. Tell me how to be more efficient and smooth and to the point. And I will try very hard to take on board your feedback. Thank you so much, and please look forward to many more instructive videos in the future. Thanks again. Good chess to you. Bye-bye.